I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said he'll hold a call with premiers next week to discuss how governments are keeping citizens safe. This comes as surging cases of the Omicron variant of COVID-19 force provinces to postpone non-urgent surgeries and reduce access to COVID-19 tests. Meanwhile, the fast-moving Omicron variant is complicating a key question. How does the COVID-19 pandemic end and the world coexist with this virus? Experts seem to agree that the coronavirus itself is here to stay and that Omicron is likely not the last mutation. However, at some point, it is expected that different parts of the world, probably at different times, will tamp down the virus enough to consider it like any other of the health threats we live with. Well, joining us now to give us a look into how the virus may evolve in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with a brief review of how the coronavirus has mutated over the course of the pandemic.
Well, it's 2022, and over the past few months, we have unfortunately learned quite a bit of the Greek alphabet, from Alpha now to Omicron. Alpha, as we know, was the first highly publicized variant. It appeared in Great Britain in November of 2020, and infections really surged around that time. It was about 30 to 50% more contagious than the original coronavirus, and also had a high mortality rate. At the same time, we also talked about Beta variant, which was identified in South Africa at the end of 2022. It was also found to be very contagious compared to the original strain, but we really didn't have a big impact with Beta in Canada specifically. Delta is the variant that we've heard about the most at this point, first identified in India in late 2020. It spread throughout the world, becoming the predominant version until Omicron. But the Delta variant still exists. It's still very concerning. It's estimated to be 90% more transmissible than the Alpha variant, and Delta has caused significant severe disease more than Alpha. Which really brings us today in Omicron. There's still a lot to learn about Omicron. It was identified in Botswana and South Africa in November of 2021, and we had a lot of cases that came about in the past few months. It seems to be far more transmissible than even Delta, but the evidence points it may not be as severe.
Now, this is a very active virus, Dr. Raut. Why does this virus continue to mutate like this?
Right. So viruses are constantly changing. Their genetic code is really prone to changes called mutations that can affect how a virus looks or affects its host. Viruses do rely on a host to survive and replicate. So they invade the body of a human in this case, and then their own genetic material or RNA enters the cells, and that code can sometimes be not so perfect, and we call that a mutation, and they happen quite frequently.
And it's interesting that the Omicron variant can surpass those who are double vaccinated. So how is the virus able to do this?
Well, most of the time when the mutations occur, they really are of no consequence. One adjustment doesn't really change the protein configuration of the virus. These small changes, we call them drifts, minor alterations there. But what's consequential are shifts, major changes in the structure of a virus. If a virus keeps mutating, it accumulates different mutations. It then would be a major shift, and it responds differently to treatments, becomes less recognizable to the antibodies, and that way even natural infection or vaccination is decreased.
All right, Dr. Raut. Well, now as we're being advised to get booster doses, how likely are we to see other variants that can impact the triple vaccinated?
That's very true. I remember most of the mutations being of minimal consequence. There are still many variants of coronavirus that we don't quantify as variants of concern. I think it's certainly possible, but unlikely, that we'll see a variant that may neutralize even triple vaccinated individuals' immunities.
And what about herd immunity, Dr. Raut? We talked a lot about this last year. Can herd immunity eventually help us to be able to live and coexist with this virus?
Herd immunity is key here. If the individual doesn't have proper immunity, the virus can enter the person, replicate more, and cause more mutations and then more variants. If you have strong immunity, let's say from triple boosting, it's very difficult for the virus to replicate, as the immune system will just kill it off before it reaches that state. So once we have enough people with herd immunity from boosters or even from infections, we'll expect that the virus will not be able to replicate and spread as much. And then that'll cause a nice drop in the morbidity and mortality we are unfortunately seeing.
All right, Dr. Ed, a quick 30 seconds left here, but any last messages to our viewers who may be frustrated with newly introduced restrictions?
Fair enough. I mean, in the past 2 years, we have seen more than 5 million lives lost, billions affected there, and everyone does have the sensation of fatigue and deja vu. To them, I say, stay strong. You are not alone. And in the words of Gwendolyn Brooks, even if you're not ready for the day, it cannot always be night.
As Canadian taxpayers start off the new year, they will have to contend with rising taxes in a number of areas. This is according to a new report by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. The 2022 New Year's Tax Changes report says there will be changes to income taxes, carbon taxes, property taxes, and more. The report notes that despite the ongoing pandemic, there will be increases to EI and CPP contributions. Franco Terrazzano, the federal director of the CTF, says if you're making more than $40,000 a year, you'll see your federal income tax bill go up thanks to rising payroll taxes. Well, with us to unpack the findings in this report is Mr. Franco Terrazzano himself. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on.
So what are some of the key takeaways from the New Year's Tax Changes report, sir?
The key takeaway is that if you're making more than $40,000, expect to see your federal income tax bill going up because of those payroll taxes. But the pain doesn't end there for taxpayers in the new year. You're going to see higher carbon tax, higher booze taxes, even higher property taxes in many big cities in Canada. And really, this is the worst possible time for politicians to be reaching deeper into our pockets. Many Canadian families are struggling with these higher prices, but we also have to remember that many people lost their job, took a pay cut, maybe even lost their small business during this pandemic. So we should be seeing taxes going down, not up.
All right, Mr. Terrazzano, let's define what exactly payroll taxes are for our viewers.
Well, those are the mandatory payments that you have to pay into the Canada Pension Plan, that you have to pay into employment insurance. So this year, expect to pay about $953 into EI. That's a $63 increase this year. But for CPP, expect to pay about $3,500, which is a $333 increase this year.
All right, sir, and taking a look at the federal tax changes, besides the carbon tax and fuel regulations, what are the other major changes we should look for?
Well, let's talk about that carbon tax increase this year. So the carbon tax is increasing for the third time during the pandemic on April 1st of this year to 11 cents per liter of gasoline. But Trudeau's not going to stop his carbon tax hikes there. He wants to continue increasing his carbon tax until 2030, when that carbon tax will be nearly 40 cents per liter of gasoline. So just talk about Canadian drivers getting soaked.
All right, sir. And your report also notes that the alcohol escalator tax will rise. So what exactly is an escalator tax, and why should our viewers care about it?
Well, what that means is that taxes on our booze continue to go up year after year after year. So if you had a hard day at the job, maybe your kids are driving you nuts and you just want to settle back with a six-pack or maybe enjoy that bottle of wine with your wife or your husband, well, politicians are reaching deeper into your pockets there. Right now, taxes make up about 50% of the price of beer, about 65% of the price of wine, and about 75% of the price of spirits.
And I came across another interesting term in your news release for this report called bracket creep. What does this term mean, sir?
Well, bracket creep is such a sneaky backdoor form of income taxes, and it happens when politicians stop moving tax brackets with inflation, and inflation can automatically bump taxpayers into higher tax brackets, even though what we can afford to buy hasn't actually gone up. Now, provinces like Alberta, Nova Scotia, PEI, and even some tax brackets in Ontario are seeing their paychecks reduced because of bracket creep. In Ontario, for example, bracket creep can cost a taxpayer up to $132 this year.
All right, sir. Well, taking a look at the provincial level, are there any notable changes we should look out for when it comes to individual provinces?
Well, bracket creep is the big one, as we just discussed, for some of these provinces. But we also have to talk about municipalities. We can't let these councillors and mayors off the hook either, because there's many big cities where you're going to be seeing property tax increases in 2022. And these are so damaging. Just think of a few examples. Let's say you own a small business, maybe a gym or a restaurant. You may have seen your revenue evaporate, but you might still have to pay this big property tax bill. Or let's say during the pandemic, you may have lost your job. You may have took a pay cut. Well, you open that mailbox and there's a big property tax increase waiting for you there from your city councillors.
All right, Mr. Terrazano, about 45 seconds left here, but do taxpayers have any positive tax changes to look forward to at the federal or provincial level?
There's just a little nugget in there for us. Fortunately, the federal government is increasing the tax-free portion of our income. So you're going to save about $89 there. But those savings are really dwarfed by the higher payroll taxes that you're also going to be paying that we talked about.
All right, sir, just a quick 30 seconds left here. But where can our viewers go to read this full report?
Well, you can find that at taxpayer.com. Just head over to our newsroom and you'll have all the information there.
All right, Mr. Franco Terrazano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Always great having you on Forum Daily, sir. Thank you again for your time.
Hey, my pleasure, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. U.S. President Joe Biden is pushing for more competition in the meat industry as U.S. consumer prices continue to rise. However, his proposed changes to labeling rules may pose a threat to Canadian beef producers and revive an old trade dispute. The current rules say that meat raised in Canada or elsewhere can still be labeled as an American product if it is processed in the United States. This after the World Trade Organization ruled that the previous U.S. meat labeling program discriminated against Canada and Mexico. However, under the review of the Product of USA labeling rules, Canadian meat producers may face disadvantages again. Well, to tell us more about what is at stake is Mr. Dennis Laycraft, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with a quick background of this issue and what exactly is at stake in this dispute.
Well, in terms of the labeling, there's really two parts here. If you go back to the original dispute, there was mandatory country of origin labeling brought in, which really put a very heavy burden on imported livestock. And it was really about the cattle and the hogs that were being imported from Canada and Mexico. And they're being heavily discounted as a result of the additional segregation and other requirements that went on. And that's what eventually led to the WTO siding with Canada that it was unfair treatment, and essentially gave us the chance, if the rules weren't changed, that there would be legal tariffs that could be put in place. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. The rules were repealed, and we're seeing a properly functioning North American market now.
All right, sir. So how much of the U.S. beef supply is supported by imports from Canada in the first place?
Normally it's about 2.9% that comes in, but there's also a significant quantity that goes from the United States up into Canada. And we have about the same number of live animals that are being imported from the US into Canada as well. We actually have the largest two-way trade in beef and live cattle in the world between Canada and the US. And it really allows some of the efficiencies regionally to flow, where areas we produce more cattle, areas the US produces more cattle that are closer to our population, and leads actually to a more competitive North American market.
So why now? Why is the U.S. government pushing for changes to the labeling rules in this particular time?
I think the main thrust of what was announced yesterday is actually about more of the competitive environment in the US. They're looking at how do you get more medium and smaller sized plants, so you simply have more processing capacity down there. There is another process that is going that is looking at the labeling, whether it's product of the US or processed in the US. And that has a fair bit to do with the amount of transformation that occurs in a product. It's fairly normal around the world for slaughter to convey origin, where you do have integrated markets like exist between Canada and the US. But, we're hopeful as we move forward that we're actually going to see a more competitive US market. That's good for us as well. But at the same time, we avoid the costly mistakes for both countries. There was a US study that estimated it was over the period that they studied, it would have cost the US industry over $8 billion lost income as well, the way the old country of origin labeling rules were being prescribed as well. So hopefully what we see is something that strengthens both markets.
All right, Mr. Laycraft, well, how has the pandemic itself impacted the supply chain in your industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think similar to the US, early on in April, May 2020, we saw plants having to shut down for a short period of time. Across North America, they've spent $1.5 billion in different things to protect worker safety in the plants. And since that time, we've been able to operate pretty much to full capacity. And, that's certainly allowed for a more resilient supply chain. And in both countries, we're seeing our exports grow, particularly to Asia. So it's not just, we're able to meet the supply demands in North America. We've been able to help fill that void around the world as well.
All right, sir, just a quick 30 seconds left here, but where can our viewers learn more about your organization?
They can certainly come to our website, www.cattle.ca. But again, one thing I always like to remind people, we have one of the greatest trade relationships in the world. We have the largest two-way trade of any two nations in the world. And quite often, Canada is the largest export market for U.S. agri-food products. It's always either Canada or China. And, we have such a great relationship that hopefully as we move forward and we look at policies, we're trying to build on the positives around those relationships.
U.S. President Joe Biden and members of Congress solemnly marked the first anniversary of the insurrection on the U.S. Capitol today. The January 6th insurrection occurred when supporters of then-President Donald Trump pushed past police and broke into the Capitol to interrupt the certification of Joe Biden's electoral victory. Lawmakers held events today to reflect on the violent attack 1 year ago. But one expert says that January 6th should also serve as a day to renew the fight for democracy. Writing in The Bulwark, Professor Jeffrey Isaac says that while there is a time and place for reconciliation, the pressing need now is for American political leaders to counter threats to democracy. Well, with us now is Professor Jeffrey Isaac, political science professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. He was also previously the editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Politics, a journal of the American Political Science Association. Dr. Isaac, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Now, a very interesting article you wrote in The Bulwark. In it, you say that this is a battle for the future of American democracy, not a battle for the soul of America, as Mr. Biden has said previously. So what do you mean by that?
Well, first, I have to say, my piece was deliberately published yesterday. I thought the speeches by Biden and Harris today were absolutely terrific. I couldn't have written them better myself. What I meant, and I know that he spoke of the soul of America today, but what I meant yesterday, the purpose of that piece was to say that the events today should not focus on healing, but should focus on the democratic political work of defending democracy. So the point was, it's not a strictly moral and it's not a spiritual question. It's a political question, organizing citizens, emphasizing the importance of democratic legitimacy, and doing the work of changing the law to defend our democracy. So that was my point. And the rhetoric of the soul of America or the soul of the nation is fine in the way in which it was used today by Biden, which was in a speech that was very clearly political.
All right, Dr. Isaac, well, how should political leaders move forward from this in order to counter threats to democracy revealed by the January 6th insurrection?
Well, I would say two things. One is that unfortunately, and President Biden said this today in the speech, but many of us have been saying this very clearly for a long time, and the Bulwark in particular is dedicated to saying this. Unfortunately, one of the two major political parties in our system is firmly behind Trumpism. And with the exception of a few members who are either retiring or, in the case of Liz Cheney, being primaried by Trumpist Republicans, the Republican Party is not really interested now in defending democracy. So when you ask what should political leaders do, we're talking primarily about leaders of the Democratic Party, President Biden, Pelosi, Schumer, and then independents and some former Republican intellectuals and activists, like people associated with the bulwark. But it's mainly the Democratic Party that has to do this work. And the work that needs to be done in the first instance is legislative work. It's gaining passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Enhancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. The Democrats need to pass this legislation, but more importantly, and some other legislation as well, the 2022 elections and the 2024 presidential elections are really, really important in terms of the future of democracy. So passing voting rights legislation and electoral fairness legislation is very important, but equally important is mobilizing citizens and convincing a broad swath of the American public that democracy needs to be defended. And that means not electing Republicans who really are trying to erode and attack democracy.
All right, Doctor, just about a minute left here, but taking a look at the American citizen's perspective, recent polling shows that Americans are split over the nature of the events of January 6th, especially along political lines. So what are the implications, if any, of this situation?
Well, the implications are very serious. And, they've been pointed out by many people. A Canadian political scientist, Thomas Homer Dixon, published a piece recently that's gotten a lot of attention. He simply said what lots of us have been saying, which is that kind of the soil for authoritarianism is deeply embedded in American culture. The fact that so many people along partisan lines are willing to accept lies and conspiracy theories is very, very dangerous. It means that the challenges are very great. I don't think a majority of people are in the camp of authoritarianism. And I think it is important to mobilize supporters of democracy and convince independents that it's important for them too to support democracy. But it's a challenge. It's an ongoing challenge. It requires political leadership, and it also requires a dedicated commitment of activists and citizens.
Some insightful remarks, Dr. Isaac. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much. I appreciate what you've done. Thank you.
Sir. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and thanks for joining us on Forum Daily's Week in Review. Be sure to join us for more news during the week. Take care, Canada.